Welcome to Modeling Mastery, the podcast where we explore the art and science of software design. I'm Hex.
And I'm Byte. We're starting our deep dive into Vaughn Vernon's book, Implementing Domain-Driven Design. Today, we're cracking open Chapter 1, Getting Started with DDD. This chapter sets the foundation for our entire journey. It asks the big questions: what is DDD really for? When should you use it? And, just as importantly, when should you not? It's about understanding the why before we get lost in the how.
Exactly. It's about making a deliberate choice, not just chasing another acronym. So for our first episode of this chapter, let's tackle the most fundamental question a developer will ask.
Byte, you and I have been in this industry long enough to see countless methodologies come and go. For a developer with a few years of experience, seeing something like domain-driven design can feel like just another trend to learn. So let's start there. Why should they bother? What problem is DDD actually trying to solve?
That's the perfect place to start. I think for many developers, especially in the backend world, the problem feels very familiar even if the name isn't. You join a project, you look at the so-called domain model, and what you find is a collection of anemic objects. They're basically just bags of getters and setters that mirror database tables. All the business logic, the rules, the processes, the things that actually make the company money is smeared across a dozen different service classes.
You've just described what Martin Fowler calls the anemic domain model, and it's a plague in enterprise software. The tragedy is that you pay all the costs of building an object model, like dealing with object relational mapping, but you get none of the benefits. The software doesn't actually model the business, it models the database schema.
Exactly. And as a developer trying to add a new feature or fix a bug, it's incredibly painful. You have to hunt through layers of services to figure out how a simple business rule is enforced. Changing one thing has unpredictable side effects. The code doesn't reveal its intent. You can't read it and understand the business. That's the core problem I see DDD addressing. It fights back against that complexity by putting the real business logic back where it belongs, into a rich, expressive domain model at the heart of the software.
I think there's another layer to that problem, which is the root cause of the anemic model in the first place, the communication gap. There's a constant lossy translation happening on most projects. The business experts talk about customers, policies, and invoices. The developers hear that, translate it into tables, columns, services, and DTOs, and build the system in this technical language. When the business expert asks for a change, the developer has to translate it back. It's a game of telephone, and the software is always the garbled message at the end.
That really resonates with my team's move to hexagonal architecture. We're putting in all this effort to create a boundary that protects the domain core from infrastructure concerns. But what are we protecting? If the core is just a set of anemic data structures, we've built a fortress around an empty treasure room. DDD feels like the missing piece. It's the discipline for crafting what goes inside that hexagon. It insists that the language spoken by the team, the ubiquitous language, as the book calls it, is the same language you see in the code. No more translation.
And that elevates the entire endeavor. The software stops being just a technical artifact and becomes a valuable, long-lasting asset for the business. It's an investment in centralized knowledge. When the domain model is the business logic expressed in the business's own language, it becomes a tool for reasoning, for analysis, and even for shaping the business itself. The design is no longer just what it looks like. The design is truly how it works.
So for that developer with 3 years of experience, the reason to bother is this. DDD is a path to writing more resilient, more maintainable, and ultimately more valuable code. It's an approach that helps you manage the inherent complexity of the business domain, not just the technical complexity of the stack. You end up with software that makes sense, that tells a story about the business it serves, and that's a fundamentally better and more satisfying way to build.
Precisely. It's about shifting your focus from being a programmer who works on a business system to becoming a software developer who models a business domain. Chapter 1 lays the groundwork for making that shift, starting with how to even decide if your project is complex enough to warrant this kind of approach. In our last episode, we established why a developer should care about domain-driven design as a way to fight complexity and build more valuable software. But this leads to the next critical question, which the book addresses right away. DDD is an investment. How do you know if your project is worth that investment?
This is a huge point, and I'm glad the book doesn't present DDD as a silver bullet for every problem. The reality is, for a lot of software, it's total overkill. The book brings up the classic example of a CRUD application: create, read, update, delete. If your application is essentially a user interface slapped on top of a database where every operation is just a simple data manipulation, you don't need DDD.
That's the glorified database table editor we see so often. If the business logic is minimal and you can trust users to essentially just edit rows through a form, investing in a deep domain model is a waste of resources. You're bringing a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Right. The book gives a handy, if informal, DDD scorecard to help you gauge this. It suggests looking at the number of business operations. If your system has fewer than 30 or so distinct use cases, each with minimal logic, it's probably simple enough for a more straightforward data-centric approach. It's when you start creeping past 30 or 40 user stories that you might be heading into DDD territory.
And that number is just a starting point. The more telling factors are strategic. The book pushes us to ask, will this application grow in complexity? Is this a core strategic part of the business that will need to change and adapt over several years? A throwaway internal tool is a very different beast from a company's flagship product. The real value of a domain model is its malleability and its ability to handle evolving business rules gracefully.
That really hits on a key danger the book points out. As developers, we are terrible at estimating complexity up front. We look at a set of requirements and think it's simple, but then as we start building, the hidden rules and edge cases start crawling out of the woodwork. What looked like a simple CRUD app turns into a big ball of mud because the initial architecture wasn't designed to handle the domain's true complexity.
That's the trap. You choose a lightweight, data-centric framework because it's fast for simple things, but once the complexity reveals itself, you're stuck. You've made a major architectural decision, and it's the wrong one. The book suggests another powerful indicator is when the domain itself is new and not well understood by anyone. If nobody has built this specific thing before, you can almost guarantee it's complex.
That's when you need the discovery process that's built into DDD. You can't just implement a spec. You have to experiment and learn alongside the domain experts to figure out what the model even is. Trying to build that with a simple CRUD mindset is a recipe for disaster. So it's not just about the number of features, but the nature of those features. Are they simple data manipulations or complex changing business behaviors?
Exactly. So to summarize the book's guidance, you should seriously consider DDD if your project involves significant behavioral complexity, if it's a long-term strategic asset that needs to evolve, or if you're exploring a novel business domain. If it doesn't meet those criteria, a simpler approach is likely more effective.
So the first step for any developer listening is to take an honest look at their project using that scorecard as a guide. Ask yourself and your team, are we just managing data or are we modeling a complex living part of our business? Getting that answer right seems to be the foundation for everything that follows.
We've established that DDD is a strategic choice for tackling complex domains. Now we can start to get into the how. The book introduces what is arguably the most fundamental pattern in all of domain-driven design, something it calls the ubiquitous language.
Right, and I have to admit, when I first heard that term, my initial reaction was, oh great, another buzzword that means developers now have to talk like the marketing department. I think a lot of developers hear it and assume it just means adopting business jargon.
That is the most common and most dangerous misconception. The book is very clear on this point. The ubiquitous language is not a pre-existing dictionary that domain experts hand to the development team. It's not about forcing business speak onto developers. Rather, it's a language that is deliberately and collaboratively crafted by the entire team, developers and domain experts working as peers.
This is where the concept became powerful for me. It's a shared model of communication. The book gives that perfect, painful example of the anemic save customer method with a dozen parameters. That method name tells you nothing about the business intent. Is the customer moving? changing their name, getting a new phone number, you have no idea. The code has lost all connection to the business reality.
Exactly. And the ubiquitous language is the cure for that ambiguity. In a model driven by this language, you wouldn't have a generic save customer method. You would have explicit intention-revealing methods like relocate to, new address, or change personal name to new name. The code itself begins to speak the language of the specific business operation.
So it's about creating a direct, unambiguous link between the words we use to talk about the system and the names we use in the code. When the team discusses committing a backlog item to a sprint, there should be a backlog item object in the code with a commit to sprint method on it. The model becomes the concrete expression of the team's shared understanding.
And that's the ubiquitous part. It's found everywhere. It's the language used in team meetings, it's the language on the whiteboard diagrams, it's the language in the user stories, and most critically, it's the language embedded in the source code. The book says this results in zero translations between the business and the software. That direct mapping is what makes the model so powerful and so resilient to change.
And it's not a static dictionary you create on day one. The book emphasizes that the language evolves as the team's insight into the domain deepens. You might start with one term, but through the process of modeling and discussion, you discover a more precise or more powerful term. The language and the model are refined together.
It's a living thing, just like the business itself. It forces a level of rigor and clarity that is often missing. When developers and domain experts have to agree on a single explicit language, it uncovers ambiguities and misunderstandings in the business process that might have gone unnoticed for years.
So it's the primary tool for closing that communication gap we talked about before. It's not just about naming things well, it's about building a shared understanding that is directly and faithfully reflected in the software we build. It's the foundation upon which everything else in DDD rests.
So far, we've painted a pretty compelling picture of DDD's benefits. We've talked about fighting complexity and building a shared understanding through the ubiquitous language. But the book is very honest that this approach is not a silver bullet, nor is it easy. It comes with some significant challenges.
That's right. It's not a free lunch. The first challenge the book highlights is the investment of time and effort. It plainly states that to do this properly, it's going to take more time. You aren't just jumping in and writing code. You're expected to think deeply about the business domain, have lengthy conversations, and iteratively refine the model. In a culture that prioritizes immediate feature velocity, that can be a tough sell.
That time investment is directly tied to the second and perhaps most critical challenge, getting meaningful and continuous involvement from domain experts. The book is uncompromising on this. Without access to the people who truly know the business, you cannot discover the deep knowledge required to build a rich model. And these experts are almost always the busiest people in the organization.
And the book is clear that a domain expert isn't just a job title. It's the person who knows a specific line of business inside and out. It could be a product designer, a senior salesperson, or even the CEO. Getting their dedicated time isn't a nice to have. The book presents it as a prerequisite for success. If you can't secure that, you're not really doing DDD.
Which leads to the third major challenge, and this one is on us as developers. It requires changing the way we think. We are trained as technical problem solvers. We see a requirement and our minds jump to database schemas, API endpoints, and caching strategies. DDD forces us to subordinate those technical details and first think purely in terms of the business domain's concepts and behaviors.
The book has a fantastic example of this mindset shift with the backlog item in a Scrum model. The typical anemic approach to commit a backlog item would be for a service layer to call a bunch of setters on the object, something like backlog item.set sprint ID and backlog item.set status. The backlog item itself is just a dumb data holder. All the logic and rules are in the client.
It's a procedural script acting upon a data structure.
Exactly. But the DDD approach models the actual business behavior. The backlog item would have a single method, commit to sprint. All the complex rules, like checking if the item is already scheduled for release or uncommitting it from a different sprint first, are encapsulated inside that method. The backlog item is no longer a passive data bag. It's an active, behavior-rich object that enforces its own business rules. That's a profound shift in thinking for a developer.
It is, and it connects all three challenges. You need the time to talk to the domain expert to learn that committing is a core concept with its own rules. That knowledge then forces you to shift your developer mindset away from simple data manipulation toward modeling rich behavioral objects. It's a complete ecosystem.
Which is why you have to be able to justify this investment. You can't just tell your manager it's a better way to code. You have to articulate the business value that this approach leads to software that is less error-prone, easier to change, and more closely aligned with the company's strategic goals. This first chapter is really about setting the stage, not just for the technical patterns, but for the cultural and organizational commitments needed to make DDD succeed.